Okay, so here we are, end of the semester. Here is your final exam review. It'll be consistent with how we've conducted other reviews for this class. I just want to make sure that you're best positioned to hit the highlights of this past semester for this class. As far as the exam itself, we're looking at 50 true, false, or multiple choice questions, plus one 10-point extra credit question if you get it right. The exam will be due late the evening of December 16th. That's a Sunday evening. That way I come in on Monday and I start making sure that everything is ready and I'm ready to submit grades come noon on Wednesday. Any issues, please get with me right away so that I can get it resolved. Throughout the course of the semester, we've had all kinds of luxury when it comes to deadlines and pretty flexible deadlines. Things start getting a little bit more concrete as we near the end of the semester, simply because there's very little in the way of wiggle room when it comes to the submission of your grades. Lastly, thanks for being a part of the UAF HSEM program, and more importantly, from my perspective, thank you for being a part of our class. Make sure you complete your class review so that I can make this class better. Without any further ado, we'll jump right into this. So, broke the review down into several sections just so it makes it easier for you in kind of referencing components of the review with components and various lessons associated with the class. That's all, nothing crazy. Start out with that very first concept that we have talked about quite often throughout the course of the semester. And it's this idea of the creation of initially the Office of Homeland Security and then ultimately the Department of Homeland Security. How big of an undertaking was this? There's some historical perspective involved with that. You may recall the initial formation of the Department of Defense. So much like the question, I think this would be almost the third time you've seen this question. How big of an undertaking was the reorganization? Focus on the concept of the scope of the reorg, okay? Hopefully no issues there for you. There's also a question that comes up on a couple of occasions now with regard to this idea of counterintelligence and whose function, which governmental entity is responsible for the function of counterintelligence here within the United States. And I think if you look at that photo on that particular slide, that should give you a pretty good idea of whose role it is to fulfill the need for counterintelligence within the United States. And we'll talk about exactly what constitutes counterintelligence here in a moment. Another item that comes up repeatedly, again on your final, is the position of the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence's role. Tell me what the intended purpose is for the Director of National Intelligence. And I'll give you a little bit of a hint. You should also understand that this particular position replaced the Director of the CIA as the country's principal advisor to the President on matters associated with intelligence. Know what the role of the DNI is, know about the fact that it replaced the Director of the CIA, and know I guess I kind of said the role. And if you hit those 3 points for that question, not an issue there. Right out of our textbook, there's this concept of security, and the text did a pretty decent job of defining what constitutes security. And if you recall, for the purposes of the exam, that textbook definition on what is security, you'll do well on this question. The role of the USA Patriot Act. What was the intent behind the USA Patriot Act? And I think if you recall, we referenced on a couple of occasions now this idea of really what the government wanted when they enacted the Patriot Act was an increased ability with regard to surveillance and investigative powers. Keep those two factors in mind. I think you'll do well on this particular question. And then there is a question that talked about the drivers, and it was plural at the time, the drivers behind the Patriot Act. And I did not care for that question in the past. I've since struck it from our exam here. there was part of that question that was entirely true. That the initial findings of the Hart-Rudman Commission, and we'll talk more about that again here in a moment, but the initial findings of the Hart-Rudman Commission served as a driver for the USA Patriot Act. Please, if you remember that, I know you're going to do well on that particular question. And then the very next section, Section 2, dealt with policy and law associated with Homeland Security, and one of the primary aspects of that was the Hart-Rudman Commission. And the goal, the intent behind the Hart-Rudman Commission was that it served the purpose of basically informing our government of this potential for a terrorist attack on American soil. So Hart-Rudman warned of an attack on American soil by terrorists. And as you can imagine, unfortunately, that warning went largely unheeded. Folks didn't listen to the Hart-Rudman Commission. They used the information gained by the Hart-Rudman Commission to form the Patriot Act, but unfortunately, that's like closing the barn door after the horse has run away. September 11 attack had already taken place by that time. So, yeah, it was a warning that went largely unheeded. A warning reference a terrorist attack on American soil. And then we looked at aspects of terrorism, and we talked about the difficulty in defining terrorist-based acts, right? And this idea that terrorism and a functioning definition associated with terrorism may center around matters associated with the targets of the attackers, perhaps their motivations and ideologies, their intent behind what it is that they're looking to accomplish, and even their behaviors and actions. So if you remember those kinds of things, when we look to define terrorism, oftentimes the disputes amongst the various people who are creating these definitions center upon, various targets, motivations, ideologies, intents, behaviors, actions, and even the actors themselves. So there's that aspect of terrorism that I want to make sure that I draw your attention to it in preparation for this exam. The next thing, on your midterm, there was a question that dealt with, since the 70s, where have we seen the most instances of terrorism? And your text references places like Latin America, the Middle East, North Africa, and Western Europe. So if you can remember some of those places that I just identified, have there been terrorist attacks in other regions? Yes, of course there have been terrorist attacks in other regions. But again, when we're looking at the frequency and intensity of those attacks, keep the locations I just talked about in mind, please, for the purpose of that question. And then there's the so-called trick question that I threw in on your exam, both in the midterm and again here in the final, where I talk about, tell me what is meant by this form of terrorism known as state-sponsored terrorism. What is state-sponsored terrorism? Understand that, and you will do well on that question. There is this phenomenal feature that made available by the internet known as the Global Terrorism Database, GTD. And the GTD breaks down all kinds of statistics for us. One of the statistics that they look at that's primarily interesting for us here, residents in the United States, is this idea of how frequent does a terrorist attack take place here in the United States versus the rest of the world. And in an effort to drive home the importance of your understanding perspective with that regard to the frequency and intensity of terrorist attacks, please understand that the total number of attacks within the U.S. equals about 3% of all terrorist-based attacks. That number is important, 3%. It gives you an idea of at least the overall percentage of terrorist-based attacks involving the United States itself. As promised, we need to talk a little bit about this phenomenon known as counterterrorism. And for starters, counterterrorism, hey, that's different than anti-terrorism, right? These are two separate concepts. So what is it that I mean by this particular term, counterterrorism? How is it different from anti-terrorism? Know that first. And next, this concept of counterterrorism has been around for quite some time. Most notably, in recent times, the primary counterterrorism strategy, how we defend and how we conduct offensive measures, right? Because that is counterterrorism, defensive and offensive measures. And primarily, when we are talking about offensive measures, what did the Bush administration do? How did we look to effectively counter terrorist activities? Through what kinds of means? And for the most part, what you're going to see is we've been involved, and the veterans within our student body here are going to understand this. Hey, it primarily revolved around military intervention. And so the main way in which the United States has been involved in counterterrorism-based activities is through military intervention. Understand that well, be able to recall that for the purpose of the exam. Boom, another win. Transnational crime. There's been a large-scale movement of individuals around the globe. As major areas of the world are subject to wars, ethnic cleansing, impossible living conditions, as large-scale groups of people migrate around the world, there is the potential for transnational crime and more importantly, transnational criminals to kind of move with that flow of people. So a factor in the spread of transnational organized crime right now might be, in fact, these mass migrations currently taking place across the globe. Keep that in mind. So this idea, can a tiger change its stripes, right? What I'm referring to with this particular slide is, in fact, still a reference to transnational organized crime. And there have been some changes within aspects of how the transnational organized criminal makes their living, so to speak, right? And initially, we may have had severe issues associated with drug trafficking, right? And don't get me wrong, there are still some issues associated with that. But as we crack down on drug trafficking with more harsh laws, sentencing reforms, those kinds of things, we've actually succeeded in driving the transnational organized criminal into different areas of crime. What might those other areas of crime be? Hopefully that'll help you with that question. So some material hazards and weapons, right? And of course, we've got to define this concept of what constitutes a weapon of mass destruction. And if you think about it, and the image on the slide here should give you kind of a hint. Something that is capable, when used, it effectively destroys large numbers of people, damages incredible amounts of property. By definition, that constitutes a WMD. So please keep that one in mind. Neat little picture here. This particular robust bacterium, right? Effectively, it's a nerve agent, botulinum. And if you think about it, back when I think we were prepping for the midterm exam, I talked about people who get injections of a form of botulinum in under their skin, and it does something specifically to the muscles in the area where that kind of a agent is I want to say deployed, where it's utilized, right? Where it's been injected. And what does it do? Does it cause skin contamination? Does it cause a fever? I mean, what does botulinum do? And if you're familiar with the effects of botulinum, and primarily that it causes paralysis of the muscles in the affected area, you'll do well on that particular question. Some naturally occurring risks that we should talk about. I've been telling you for quite some time that you should be aware of the hazard associated with floods, right? Because that is the most frequent emergency within the United States that you are probably going to have to deal with. A little bit less commonly encountered would be various forms of cosmic risks. What kinds of cosmic risks are out there? Do we have to worry about comets? Do we have to worry about asteroids? What else? Solar storms. There was that question on your midterm about Carrington event, Carrington effect. I don't split hairs like that often. And if I do, I'm going to make sure I draw your attention to it. So that was more of a typo on my part, but you don't even have to worry about it on the final exam. I got rid of that particular question. It just, right now, I just want to keep things very clear. So understand what kinds of cosmic hazards are out there. You'll do well on that question. What's a dirty bomb? How does it different from a more conventional nuclear weapon? What is it that makes this different from a nuclear weapon? And I think you'll recall we talk about the fact that there's more of a traditional explosive charge that ends up disseminating radioactive material. Dirty bomb. Where do these IEDs come from? The photo here, you're looking at something along the lines of an anti-tank mine. So, I mean, what else? Where do the bad guys get their hands on stuff that they can then turn into an improvised explosive device? Might it be from, military ordnance? Sure. Might it be from oil-based fuels? Okay. How about agricultural fertilizers, right? If we mix fuel and certain forms of fertilizer, what do we end up with this? So where do the bad guys get the raw materials to make their bombs? Know that, please. Next section deals with aspects of emergency management. This question was problematic on your midterm. And it got into the difference between a vulnerability and a threat, and they were splitting hairs, and I actually think the text was wrong. And so I tried to clean it up for you. And I'll tell you now that in everyday language, when I hear the word vulnerability, what I take that to mean is that a given target, a given thing, might be harmed by a particular threat. In other words, vulnerability means that the target is undefended from a particular threat. If you can keep that in mind, you'll do well on this question. That's really all it is. Okay? All kinds of people like to pile on FEMA and their failure, their lack of a solid performance when it came to the response to Hurricane Katrina. I get that. That makes sense and stuff, but understand a little bit more than just that. Understand that FEMA was severely critiqued as a result of their response to Hurricane Katrina, and they performed very poorly. As a result of performing so poorly, within the federal government themselves, they lost additional responsibility. They lost autonomy, right? Autonomy, and so understand that, but know that in part it wasn't necessarily their fault either. They were operating with a significantly reduced staff level, right? Some 85% of the required staff had been gone from Hurricane Katrina for over a year prior to, 85% of FEMA's staff were gone prior to the agency's response to Hurricane Katrina is what I meant to say. I apologize if that wasn't clear. So they had far fewer staff in the year prior to Hurricane Katrina. So in all likelihood, that was a factor in their poor performance. They lost their seat at the cabinet with the president as a result. There was, greater confusion and an expanded chain of command. So these kinds of factors all played into FEMA's performance post-Hurricane Katrina. Know that, you'll do well. We've got Section 8, and of course one of the aspects of Section 8 that came through was this mnemonic device, evil done. And so if you understand what each of the letters here, how they correspond to a particular category for this way of thinking about why a particular target's attractive to a bad guy, I think you'll do very well. Speaking of bad guys or good guys, depending upon how you look at it, we've got this idea of an insider threat. And when we talk about an insider threat, what do I mean? What do I mean? How do they pose a threat to an organization? Could they be someone like a disgruntled employee or a former employee? Understand that. You'll do well on that particular question. Infrastructure. We've got this electrical power grid. I did my best to kind of emphasize to you how fragile of a system it really is. And it's old, right? It was never really designed to perform as it's currently being asked to perform. It suffers from varying levels of usage on the part of the consumer. So let's say New York City, from time to time, they'll experience what's known as a brownout as opposed to a blackout, right? Blackout, complete loss of power. Brownout means that in the summertime, with all of the additional draw on the electrical grid as a result of things like air conditioning, the power system, the grid itself is just incapable of fully meeting the demand. And so as a result, there's a reduced ability to meet the demand, otherwise known as a brownout. And so we've got this increasing demand, the idea that it was never really designed to function in the way it's currently being asked to function, that we ask all kinds of varying loads of the system, and it's old. Keep that all in mind. I think you'll do quite well on that question. Resiliency. Your text defines resiliency as your ability or an organization's ability to adapt and survive to things like fluctuations and disruptions and to be able to restore operability in a brief period of time. So remember what constitutes resiliency. We've got a problem with, from time to time, this idea of private-public partnerships. And in a sense, it's because of that last little fact that I underlined there on the slide. The public component of the private-public partnership functions to largely regulate through laws and acts kind of things. And the private component serves to really make money. And those two conflicting agendas oftentimes result in an inability to be effective or as effective as it could be. So if you remember that, you'll do well with that particular slide. And we've got the twin pillars of what constitutes critical infrastructure security. And their strategy that largely is associated with these twin pillars is this concept of protection as well as resilience. And protection and resilience contribute to stronger critical infrastructure security. Keep that in mind for me, please. Oh, okay, so cybersecurity, information communication security. What's SCADA? Supervisory control and data acquisition systems. What does it do? Keep that one in mind for this particular question. What does SCADA do? How does it work? How do we define it? You may have heard me talk a little bit about a botnet or a bot network. What is it? How does it work? Know that, you'll do well on this particular question. We know that we're seeing an increase in the frequency of attacks on cyber infrastructure now, and the text did a decent job of teasing out the rate with which we are seeing an increase in this kind of effort on the part of malevolence individuals. And so we are seeing something of an 8-time increase between 2006 and 2012, and I know if I plot it out further on this graph, there's probably even more of an increase, but at least between 06 and 12, an increase of some 8 times is important for you to remember. So what does the federal government do to try and strengthen the system? And they kind of came up with this U.S. Computer Emergency Response Team known as U.S. CERT, and the primary tool by which U.S. CERT looks to provide for cybersecurity is through this use of a program known as Einstein. So know what Einstein does. Know that it's a product employed by U.S. CERT. You'll do well on that question. All of that looks to all of that technology and effort looks to combat the computer virus, right? And so, what is a virus? How does it work? Know that when a virus infects a given computer system, it may take seconds to discover the. No, let me go back. It may take a brief period of time for the virus to actually infect a system. Could be seconds or minutes within when the individuals gain access to a system. Could be seconds or minutes. When we actually discover it or detect it, that could take months or years sometimes. So that's the main point that I want to get across here. When the bad guys act, they may actually have compromised the system within seconds or minutes. When the good guys can actually detect and or discover the efforts of the bad guys, that could take months or years. So understand that varying difference in time frames, please. One of the more famous or infamous pieces of malware out there, I think it's more of a worm than anything else, was Stuxnet. So remember that video we watched, 0 Days? What did Stuxnet do? If you know what Stuxnet was rumored to have done, you'll do well on this question. Maritime security, right? There's this concept of the high seas in when we refer to maritime security. What constitutes the high seas? You know, this idea perhaps jurisdiction beyond any one state would be something that I'd certainly be keeping in mind for that particular question. How much of our global trade is transported on maritime vessels these days? And I've heard numbers thrown around in the area of roughly 90%. Keep that in mind. You'll do well on that question. One of the ways in which we actually improved and expanded our ability to conduct global trade was through the use of the modern-day cargo container. Prior to the cargo container, they would take individual products, cases of them, let's say, put them in a large cargo net. Then a crane would then winch the cargo net containing the materials on board. They would be then unpacked out of the net, stacked on the ship, and the process would be repeated. With the use of a modern-day cargo container, full containers, sometimes two to four at a time, can be brought on board a ship, stacked, secured, and repeated. And so as a result, these are some factors on this particular slide that are going to directly correlate to the changes that were made with regard to global trade through the use of the modern day cargo container. Aviation security. How many flights do we have moving around the world at any one time, and how significant is are the flights associated with those taking place within the United States, and accounting for half of the global commercial aviation trade or traffic would certainly be something that you might want to keep in mind. You've got this individual. We instituted a hardened cockpit in the wake of 9/11. And as a result of that hardened cockpit, I made reference when we were talking about aviation security that sometimes even the best of efforts can be used against us. And in this particular instance, you had the German Wings Flight 9525, March of 2015. The pilot leaves the cockpit, the co-pilot locks the door, and as a result of locking the door and prohibiting the captain from coming back in the plane, the co-pilot chose to crash the plane and kill everybody on board. So the best of intentions can be used to harm us in the end. Remember that. increased cockpit security has failed to mitigate threats from pilots with suicidal or murderous intent, you'll do well there. Here's just a neat little piece of technology I threw on the slide. Keep it in mind. You've got a program within Department of Homeland Security where they were looking to increase aspects of aviation security, and one of the products that they came up with was known as Guardian. And Guardian uses a laser to kind of confuse an incoming missile's sensors to pick up the plane. Just a neat piece of technology. You may not have been aware about it being out there. It's worth noting that. A little bit of talk about ground transportation security and this idea of, some of the issues associated with road transportation. Hey, it's expensive. We've got aspects of collisions and safety that we have to be concerned about. We've got bad people having access to a rather open and vulnerable system, and it lacks efficiency when we talk about roads. And more about those collisions and stuff. Here you've got this idea of how often are Americans dying in traffic collisions as opposed to those who are feloniously killed, murdered, right? And understand that twice as many Americans die in these kinds of situations, these collisions, than are ever murdered on an annual basis. So it's important to keep that in mind. What else is important to keep in mind is the age of our roadway system. Critics of ground transportation right now are citing an aging infrastructure. We looked at the report cards associated with our infrastructure. We looked at specifically roadways, and we saw that many states were getting poor grades associated with their roadways. That, and in conjunction with the fact that our roads were mostly built in the 1960s, and you have an idea of perhaps a part of why we have such an issue with collisions taking place on our roadways. I told you that there's a difference between how we transport things on railways and how we transport things with vehicles, surface roadway transportation systems. What's the difference in efficiency associated with railways and roadways? If you know that, I think you'll do well on that particular question. In simplest terms, border security threats can be separated into two categories. You've got bad people and bad stuff, right? And when we focus on aspects of border security, we have to acknowledge the fact that those are two of the things that we're really looking for. And then we have to be aware of the fact that we don't want to slow down the legitimate traffic of individuals and goods across our border. What are we focusing on and why? One of the neat things associated with border security is, in fact, the Customs and Border Protection, CBP, right? And they fulfill a wide variety of roles, and they also happen to be a rather large federal law enforcement agency. How big are they? Are they the biggest? You tell me. One of the ways in which we try to establish whether or not we're effective in our securing of our southern border is through a measurement of our rate of apprehension, right? How often are we catching people? How many people are we catching illegally trying to cross the border? And why is that a problematic measure of efficiency and effectiveness? If we truly don't understand the nature of the threats at our southern border, what is it that this actually tells us? Is this a problem? You let me know. And there is an extra credit question for you. I referenced that towards the start of the recording now, 10 points. If you've already completed your course evaluation, then there's a good chance that you'll do well in that particular question, that extra credit question on the test. So, open book, open note, quiz, exam, no need for a proctor, available as of the time that this video is uploaded into YouTube. Thank you, like I already kind of mentioned again, for being a part of our HSEM program here. Get with me right away if there's any issues. I'm going to make this available now and go back to grading papers and other written items for class. All right? Thank you, guys. Take care.